Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for our Democracy Forum debate on a nation that was born just over 50 years ago amid scenes of dreadful brutality, war, human suffering, and a driving sense of nationhood. Now, if that sounds familiar amid the scenes that we're seeing today from the Middle East, perhaps there are lessons to be learned, because the topic of our debate is uplifting, it's forward-looking, and it's a far cry from the issues swirling around Palestine and Israel. Bangladesh's path to global growth. Of course, we're going to discuss mistakes and challenges, the impact of climate change, the sense of creeping authoritarianism, market competitors in a global garment trade. But what a change from that war-torn and basket case story that was all over the media half a century ago. To debate Bangladesh's path to global growth, we have a superb panel: Sohela Nazneen, Mohammed Sawa, Naomi, Hossain, Badrul Syed Ahsan. And in our audience is the chair of Democracy Forum, Barry Gardner, MP, an expert in Asia's development with first-hand experience of many of the issues that we're discussing, particularly climate. He will sum up at the end. And as always, before we begin, Lord Charles Bruce, the Democracy Forum president, will lay out the canvas and backdrop of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar hosted by the Democracy Forum, which will explore Bangladesh's path to global growth. I thank the Forum for selecting this timely and relevant issue and for assembling such a brilliant panel to discuss. I'm grateful that all our invited panelists have agreed to participate. I look forward to the deliberations under the moderation of Humphrey Hawksley, who will chair the proceedings today. Reviewing its 2023 forecast for growth in South Asia at the start of October, the World Bank raised its prediction from 5.6 to 5.8%. Its chief economist described South Asia's prospects as the polar opposite to China and East Asia. This region really does have strong fundamentals, simply because it has a young workforce. It's got lots of room to catch up, said the chief economist. Nowhere is this truer than Bangladesh, where the economy has grown faster than India and Sri Lanka over the last decade at an average annual rate of around 6%. Indeed, before the pandemic struck, the economy was growing at 8% annually, and where GDP per person leads other South Asian countries at $2,500. Paving the way for Bangladesh's prodigious rate of growth is the development of the garment sector, the second largest in the world after China, accounting for 85% of its exports. Although Bangladesh's dependence on a single industry has seen it transformed from an underemployed and impoverished society of subsistence farming to become a highly urbanized industrial workforce, it's also fair to conclude that this story of growth has no miracle about it. Indeed, it's arguable that Bangladesh is over-reliant on the garment trade, and I quote, may lose the preferential trade terms associated with its least developed status, as competition from lower cost producers such as Cambodia is rising, writes The Economist. Furthermore, it's done little to diversify into other high value-added industries, such as pharmaceuticals and electronics. I quote, hampered by graft, red tape, difficulties in obtaining credit, and a relentless brain drain. Over the course of this year, foreign currency reserves have slumped under $30 billion. And last year, the government called in the IMF as a precaution. In January, a $4.7 billion loan was agreed, yet the local currency remains wobbly, writes The Economist. Nervousness about the country's future economic prospects are widely shared. A recent survey published by the Asia Foundation in August found that only 25% of Bangladesh's polled throughout the country believe it is heading in the right economic direction. And that was a considerable deterioration since 2019, when 70% of people interviewed expressed this view. Plummeting living standards are undermining the country's confidence too. 44% of respondents to the Asia Foundation survey consider inflation to be the biggest problem they face, while 84% claim it has severely impacted their lives. Underlying the economic problems besetting Bangladesh is the prevalent hand of authoritarian politics. In explaining the fundamental nature of the challenge facing the country's continued progress, The Economist observes that overarching all is a grave worry about governance. A web of state capture and decay has spread throughout the country's institutions. Many domestic banks are thinly disguised shell operations. Foreign direct investment has begun to flag, while the country's ratings for doing business are the worst in Asia, and where access to jobs, permits, government contracts run through the ruling Awami League. The OECD policy review of Bangladesh, written for the United Nations and published last month, warns, I quote, "The impressive accomplishments to date, while commendable, have resulted in only a partial economic transformation. The persistence of significant vulnerabilities pose a potential threat to future advancements." Well, thank you very much for deciding to join our webinar today. And please, if you have any questions or comments, pass them through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. Strong fundamentals, but a mountain of challenges there: nervousness, brain drain, and the rest of it. Our first panelist is Sohela Nazneen from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. Before that, she was at the University of Dhaka and has been a consultant to numerous development agencies such as the UNDP and the MacArthur Foundation. She is also a specialist in gender equality. What are the challenges? Can Bangladesh sustain its momentum? Sohela Nazneen, give us your thoughts.
Thank you for asking me to be a part of this panel. I work in development studies, so for me, looking at the path to growth is also tied to how we think about development. And since I work on gender equality, my reflections will be about what are the current challenges to growth and development, but also how would it affect the gains that Bangladesh has made in creating a gender equal society. I will be drawing on existing literature, but also my own research. Lord Bruce has said in his introductory remarks, has talked about Bangladesh's economic miracle, but also the gaps within that in terms of how that miracle was achieved. We all know about the impressive growth rate, which did not necessarily decrease a lot given the pandemic, when pandemic hit us. But Bangladesh's development story is even more impressive, thinking in 1971, where Bangladesh was after it gained independence, a war-torn country, very poor with low levels of human capital and very weak infrastructure to what we have now in terms of the significant gains we made in social development, particularly with respect to health and education, reduction in maternal mortality, impressive rate of poverty reduction, and increased food security. But all of this is, of course, backed up by how the economy performs. And we have talked about the RMG sector, but there is also the remittance that we get from our migrant working population. There is also the factor of politics, that there was an elite consensus around reduction of poverty and the innovative practices that both state had implemented, but also our large NGO sector. But the question is, are we going to grow now? And what would our development look like? Can we sustain the momentum given the challenges that we are facing? Some of the challenges have been laid out already, thinking through the current pressures that we are facing in terms of inflationary pressures, in terms of our reserve, dollar reserve, in terms of hike in fuel prices and food prices, but also have we diversified enough in the economy? If we are over-reliant on the RMG sector, the high-end sectors that we are thinking about in terms of electronics and also pharmaceuticals, do we have the skilled labor force for that? And of course, our remittances that we are receiving are falling. So all of that means is that we are at a critical juncture. And in terms of governance and policy environment, of course, there's much to be desired. We already heard about what the business environment is like. There is a lack of trust, there is red tape, there is corruption. There is a question about, are we creating enough jobs, and also thinking through, are we creating skilled labor force for the kinds of high-end jobs that you may want to create? The public trust in the economy is in the right direction. We already heard the survey results, the recent one that was carried out by the Asia Foundation. And obviously political instability that may come with the elections upcoming elections is on everyone's mind. But let's also look at how are we doing in terms of keeping momentum in terms of development. So while the country has grown and poverty has been reduced, absolute poverty, inequality has risen. Pandemic created a lot more precarity, and that is being affected by the fact that we have a multiple crisis that's hitting us, both in terms of price hikes, but also depletion of people's savings, depletion of the networks that they could rely on. The government's response in terms of social assistance provision during the pandemic was innovative and definitely laudable. But the question is basically, how are we doing now? And we know that rates of transitory poverty is going up. There are concerns in terms of what does it mean in terms of intergenerational equity, particularly how are we going to tackle learning loss given the long school closures? There are questions around child marriage rates rising. So lots of different issues that are coming up. Of course, climate change is a big challenge, and my fellow panelists will talk about this. But are we ready for the kind of impact climate change will have? Particularly by 2050, it will wipe out 1/3 of our agricultural production, affecting the economy and food security. And there's the issue about we are rapidly urbanizing, and this seems to be quite unplanned. So given all of that, then how does this affect gender equality, where a lot of our gains are in terms of gain in women's rights and role that women play in the economy? We know that women played a critical part in the growth and development story. When we look at the RMG sector, in the initial years, women were the majority of the workforce, although that is in decline right now. There are questions around job creation not only for men, but also for women, and what are these alternative routes? We have seen actually women's labor force participation declining, particularly during COVID. Transitory poverty, as we talked about, has a real gender impact, particularly in terms of nutrition, in terms of healthcare seeking behavior, in terms of unpaid care work burden increasing for women. So basically, people are coping, but coping is not thriving. And if it is about development and growth, you need people to thrive. So given that, my point would be that we are at a very critical juncture. What we do and how we do things is going to affect where we get to go. We have an impressive story, and we are called the development miracle, and also sort of Bangladesh's miracle growth. But the question is about whether that would be sustained. And the challenges are a lot. The challenges are about creating those institutions that enable people's participation, that enable engagement with the state and the state responding to those concerns. It's also about regulation and rule of law. It's about having freedom to critique and dissent. But it's also about economic governance and what kind of structures do we have there, and are we able to curtail vested interests. So the challenge is quite huge. And there is the other challenge in terms of being a smaller country and the larger geopolitics that we have around the current economic structure and the way you participate in the treaties that are globally made that affects you. So we are at a tricky point. The question is, where do we go from now? And I'm sure my fellow panelists will have a lot to say about that. So I'll stop here.
Sohela, Nazneen, thank you very much for that. We are going to use your question as the overriding driver of the debate, but I'd like to pick you up on a couple of points on the gender equality issue. Could you give us an idea of culturally how women and men are seen, interact in Bangladesh? I know it's a big question. And then also, how important is gender equality to economic growth? I.e., if women are completely repressed and don't have that thriving that you mentioned, how much does that damage an economy?
I think culturally we have shifted over time quite a lot. So if you think about 1970s and what Bangladesh was like, obviously that has changed, particularly in terms of women's participation in work, women in education, and because we have gender parity in terms of enrollment, which wasn't there in the 1970s. And then if you think about provision of contraception and women being able to choose and in terms of how many kids they have, that norm has shifted. What hasn't shifted is sort of the second generation norms as we sort of speak of. So the first generation is having access to basic things, right? So education, being able to have access to maternal health, etc. So that's there. The second generation challenge is around being able to exercise agency in the trickier bits. So around women's sexuality, around women's bodily autonomy, around sort of women's mobility. So are people accepting of women will go to work? Yes. Are they accepting in terms of women choose their partners? That's a big question mark there. So it's those cultural nuances that you need to navigate. And there's also the issue about violence against women. Domestic violence is quite high in Bangladesh, but so is violence in the public sector, public spaces, right? So sexual harassment and other forms of harassment is quite high. So think about women going to work and you're being harassed is a difficult question mark in terms of sustaining the environment in the way that you may want to sustain. And of course, there is a conflict in terms of a culture war going on about what should women be entitled to and women's position in decision-making positions. We have female prime ministers and we have had them since 1991, which is definitely a landmark for any country I can talk about. But it's also women decision-making in all levels, right? And are they there? So the question mark
is there, is there a graph or a study that can link women freedom or gender equality to economic growth? Or has that study not yet been done?
I don't know about Bangladesh specific study. I mean, there are studies on looking at labor force participation and what does it mean. Studies on looking at how poverty reduction, sort of, if you look at very poor households, what does it mean when you have 2 income households instead of 1? So obviously there are studies on that, and then sort of decision making within the household. How does that benefit, let's say, children's welfare or certain kinds of behavior that we want to encourage. In terms of overall macroeconomic growth, and if you're putting a question mark, if you're asking about that, there are studies by Naila Kabir, which looks at growth in general and women's agency, not necessarily just Bangladesh specific, but I mean, just intuitively, if women are not participating, think about what they're contributing to the GDP, even if they're not in formal labor force, just by participating in a household production. What does that mean? And you take that figure away, what does that mean? Or even when you value women's unpaid care, that's the cooking, the cleaning, the getting the fuel, etc., water, etc., and you value that in monetary terms. And there's definitely studies for that in on Bangladesh. What does that value for?
Basically, it's the old Mao Zedong saying, isn't it, that women hold up half the world, and he said that, and they had that sort of more equality in China or East Asia than happened or is happening in South Asia. I'd like to quickly talk to you about one other thing, and you talked about possible instability because of the upcoming election, and I never really thought we'd have to be discussing this, but what is the threat, the electoral threat to growth and to the stability of Bangladesh because there's an election being held?
Well, it's partly, for a long time, I think Bangladesh's political elite was smart in the sense of continuing the policies that it had taken, right? So nobody, even with the change of power, no one threw away whatever policy that continued. And you do need a stable investment environment, which is connected to whether your political environment is stable, particularly if there is a fear of violence. So I think there's a lot of worry around the current elections in terms of how it would unfold and who would participate and what it would look like. And that's where then obviously if one of the things that Bangladesh benefited from was that despite the political skirmishes around every 5 years around elections, we did have a relatively stable situation. But this election seems a bit different.
Right. We will explore these points. Thank you so much, and stay with us because we will be returning for your wisdom, but we're going to move on now to Mohammed Gholam Sawa from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, also Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Dhaka. His expertise lies in international law, environmental law, and human rights, and he's worked or been consultant for numerous Bangladesh ministries, UN, and other agencies. He's going to examine the challenges ahead, particularly, as we've just heard, from the angle of climate. Mohammed Gholam Sawa, how worried should we be?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me in this panel discussion, and I'm happy to be joined by their esteemed colleagues. Before going to the topic, the impact of climate and the interaction between development and the climate, I would like to focus on the development journey of Bangladesh and how it goes with the change of time and how it interacts with the development and environment. As you said, I mean, the former panelist rightly underscored, and the Lord Bruce also underscored, the development journey in Bangladesh started from the Bangladesh being a war-based country, initially relied on agriculture and industrialization with the support of foreign aid and grants in order to build its economy after independence. But with the change of time, we see that Bangladesh started heavily rely on rapid industrialization that helped the country to pursue robust economic growth. Until 2010, we have seen some ups and downs in terms of political, economic, and social development. However, over the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen an unprecedented economic growth under the leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister, the existing Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina. We see the total economic landscape of the country has dramatically changed, and that helped the country basically to graduate from LDC to middle income country. And obviously Bangladesh is considered one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and the second largest in South Asia, which is called the Asian tiger. And Bangladesh is also on the track to become $1 trillion economy due to its thriving business community, which is being predicted, and it is also predicted that the country's domestic consumer market, which is about to become the ninth largest consumer market in the world. And another very important factor which basically contributed and obviously will be helpful to understand the future growth of the country, because the country is uniquely positioned to benefit from the demographic dividend, a situation where the dependency rate is low due to large working age population. The youth population, estimates around 40%, which basically allows the country or enable the country to reap the benefits of the demographic dividend. Obviously, along with the growth of the country, sustainability remains a serious challenge for Bangladesh for a couple of reasons. First of all, we see the geographical location. The country is located in a Ganges Brahmaputra Meghna Delta, which is prone to extreme, patterns of climate change because of its low-lying and flat topography. Bangladesh is considered one of the most flood prone countries in the world, where over half of the country's population is exposed to high flood risk. So this geographical location obviously is creating a challenge in terms of balance between sustainability and development. Number two is, as my former panelist highlighted, the governance issues. Obviously, in order to sustain economic growth, Bangladesh needs to improve the pillars of good governance, with particular emphasis on the institutional accountability, an area where Bangladesh is currently struggling to meet the demands of the good governance and the accountability. And another significant, crucial challenge for a country like Bangladesh is, you see, Bangladesh needs to continue with the pace of economic growth, even at the cost of sustainability, just to meet the demands of a large number of population, which is 180 million people. So in order to meet the human needs of those population, Bangladesh needs to go with the pace of the growth, even at the cost of environmental degradation that ultimately lead to climate change. So that makes a real dilemma for an emerging developing country like Bangladesh. But now I would like to focus on my second aspect that you have highlighted. Considering today's topic, Bangladesh's path to global growth. So I would like to now highlight how Bangladesh becomes the victims of global growth. I mean, in one aspect, we have seen the unprecedented economic development in a country, and now we see how global growth is making a country a victims of climate crisis. As you see that as I have highlighted, that Bangladesh is the seventh most climate change vulnerable country in the world, and the country is incurring around 3.72 billion economic losses in the last 20 years. And the IPCC projection report 2022 indicates that Bangladesh at the risk of a loss of 2.0% to 9.0% of annual GDP by the mid-end of this century due to climate change. So the impact is huge. As we can understand, the climate hazards will grab 17% of the country's land and halt 30% of its food production by 2050. And considering the large amount of pollution, the increasing impacts of climate crisis is threatening the country's efforts to reduce poverty and food insecurity, undermining the developmental needs of the people of the country. Now, what causes climate crisis? If we see in the global parlance, what are the drivers of the climate crisis? We cannot, talk about the impact of climate crisis without underscoring or without identifying the global drivers of the climate crisis, as you see. So you see, it is now undeniable and settled that the capitalist economic model, which is based on exploitation, extraction, industrial production, and expanded consumption, is the principal cause of the current climate crisis that we are having, that we are witnessing. The extractive economic system, which is got intensified by colonialism, which is considered as a historic and ongoing drivers of the climate crisis. According to the overwhelming majority of climate scientists, it is now proved that humans are the primary cause of climate change and the climate crisis. The leading scientists of the world reveal that, we have already breached the 7 out of 8 planetary boundaries. Now, the human caused climate crisis is the intentional byproduct of what I have said, capitalist economic model, which is based on extractive fossil fuel energy system, causing unabated greenhouse gas emissions and global carbon emissions. The extraction of fossil fuel, with an aim for exponential growth, facilitates large-scale industrial production and overconsumption that lead to the climate crisis that we are witnessing. Climate crisis is considered as a confrontation between such fossil fuel-based capitalism and the planet. Capitalism aims to pursue continued economic growth through massive carbon emissions at the cost of overuse and degradation of planetary support mechanism. And what are the features of this existing growth model that we are talking about? The features of the existing global growth model are exploitation, extraction, capital accumulation, industrial production, and expanded consumption, which are the main features of the existing growth driven economic system. Now, what is the idea of development, which is being pioneered by the West? Is the development has been understood as a form of progress through modernization, extractive industrialization, and economic growth. There is no point of ecology. There is no consideration of nature. There is no consideration of environment within the existing economic model. We see there were some attempts by Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, to make it as a freedom mediated development, but still we see the development model remains irredeemably anthropocentric, economistic, and growth driven. Now, with the passage of development, we see there are some concepts like the lofty models of sustainable development, and followed by we have seen the framework of even sustainable development goals. The framework of SDGs. But you see, now we are arguing that from the point of climate crisis, it is now being argued that the ambition of sustainable development fails to underscore the reality of ever deepening socio-ecological destruction of a finite planet. Rather, it allows the state, the sustainable development allows the states and corporations to mask the negative socio-ecological impacts of relentless growth-driven development. Sustainable development has been argued now is an eco-political project which might be neither sustainable nor developmental. It is considered now a palatable approach to green trap, the economic and political project of sustainable degradation already now which is being practiced across the world. And accordingly, the framework of sustainable development goals also, while highlighting the economic growth as the core driver of development, again disregards the biophysical limits, and where GDP has been arbitrarily adopted as the indicators of progress, where culture, ethics, spirituality are being subordinated to GDP and the economic forces. And we see another, another approach to development is in terms of law. We call a right to development. But again, right to development has been framed in a way that basically leads to a right-based approach to ecological destruction. Unfortunately, you see, the pursuit of human development welfare as envisioned by the right to development undeniably leads to increasing ecological destruction, a fact which remains ignored in the right to development agenda or the current growth agenda. And the right to development agenda is considered now is also extremely anthropocentric or human driven, growth driven, and it seems to mean catching up the industrialized countries with regard to their material levels of well-being, their institutional structures and political orders that systematically exclude the concerns and the needs of the developing countries like Bangladesh. And right to development very legitimately being ostensibly aimed at promoting human well-being, right to development carries the tentacles of the developmentalism, which follows the footprints of the extractive capitalism that I've highlighted, colonialism, and the Western modernity. What I'm arguing is that developmentalism is intrinsically destructive of the environment, which causes ecological collapse, not as an unintended byproduct of development, but because of inevitable consequence of unsustainable economic models or the growth we are having. Now, under the current economic model, which leads to endless exponential growth, and the continuation of the capitalist economic system, we see there are differential contributions from the countries between developed and developing countries. As I have said, Bangladesh is one of the worst victims of climate crisis, but Bangladesh contributed nothing almost to the causation of climate climate crisis. As you see, Bangladesh contributed only a meager 0.4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the world. But despite that, Bangladesh ranks as the seventh on the global climate crisis index. As you see, on the other hand, who are responsible for the commission of greenhouse gases? You see, only the G8 nations, including the USA, EU, Russia, Japan, and Canada, were together responsible for 85%. I'm repeating, 85% of the total greenhouse gas emissions that lead to cause climate crisis, and the rest is by the global south or the developing countries. So while the global north are responsible for paying climate debt or the ecological debt in terms of paying compensation, most of the developing countries, including emerging economies like Bangladesh, have right to emit greenhouse gas emissions, or they're entitled to a climate credit, not climate debt, in terms of emitting greenhouse gases. So as you see, the handful of high emitting nations from the global north are responsible to bear the burden of climate crisis. So we are now arguing that the developed countries are responsible to correct the historic injustice that Bangladesh and the other developing or emerging developing countries are facing. So the high emitters have now duty to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases by making deep carbon cuts, and they have duty to devote resources to protect people, especially the poor and the marginalized sections of the developing economic like Bangladesh. And they have also duty to compensate the victims of climate crisis in developing countries like Bangladesh. And another dimension of the existing model of development is the economic growth. What we see in the north, or in the developed countries, relies on the patterns of colonization, the appropriation of the atmospheric commons, and the appropriation of the southern resources and labor. For example, you see the British colonizer legitimized the exploitation of the Indian subcontinent, its natural resources, and its people in the name of modernity and progress, a practice which is deeply rooted, obviously, in the existing development model of Bangladesh. So, as you see, the existing climate governance, negotiations, and the decision making approaches are extremely rooted in the colonial mindset that stimulate the same power dynamics of the north south dimensions of international politics. So, and the outcome of such climate negotiation processes include solution like carbon trading, offsetting, or net zero that fail to address the root causes as well as the structural and systematic factors that lead to the current climate crisis. So we are now talking about what could be the possible way out from the discussion that we are having about, because the existing global growth model is extremely anthropocentric, capitalistic, and growth driven. Now we are focusing on the solution, what we can do, basically what could be the possible way out. We are arguing for alternatives to development approach, not alternative development, but alternatives to development. For example, the harmony with nature. For example, the degrowth. For example, decolonizing the climate coloniality we are having. What we are calling by degrowth, possibly degrowth or the limits to growth, basically implies a deconstruction of the economy together with the construction of today's productive rationality. So, deconstructing the unsustainable economy means questioning the thought, science, technology, and the institution that create the cage of rationality of modernity. So, instead of commodifying nature, instead of over economizing the world, degrowth manifests alternative approaches of internalizing the ecological foundations within the existing economic rationality and productive principles. And finally, I would say that degrowth does not only entail reducing GDP, rather it indicates reducing material throughput that facilitates to mitigate pressures on the planetary boundaries and to address climate crisis as well. And obviously, degrowth, not about, as I have said, not about reducing GDP, but also it also calls for a shift towards growth agnosticism. We need to come out from the growth fatigue. That is necessary, basically. To come out from an extremely growth-driven economic model and leading to a model which prioritizes the ecological foundations, not the growth. Rather, the ecological foundation should be the way out. But again, degrowth model should be started to be launched in the global north. As I have said, the global north bears the huge burden, a huge responsibility towards a climate crisis, while on the other hand developing countries like Bangladesh is facing the burden. So degrowth should be launched in the global north. And obviously developing countries cannot be allowed to do the capitalistic model of doing development. They also should adapt the alternatives to development approaches, but that alternatives to approaches should be seen or should be understood from the perspective of climate justice that we are having. So I'll be stopping here. I'll be happy to respond any questions.
Thank you very much. That was a moving and detailed argument that you gave. But given that you're advocating basically a complete restructuring of the world economic order, let us assume that is not going to happen overnight. Could you give us an encapsulation, because you did give us the details, 2 to 9% of GDP drop, climate change, 17% of land, 30% of food production. What do you want to see from the Bangladesh government and from the global north, as you call it, to actually help that upcoming situation? In a nutshell, what do you want to see, figures-wise, money-wise, whatever wise?
Yeah, wonderful. That's basically the way out we need to talk about. So in terms of Bangladesh, what Bangladesh should do basically in terms of economic growth that the country is doing, as I have concluded that the country like Bangladesh also cannot afford the existing patterns of economic growth because of its vulnerabilities to climate change. The existing model needs to be stopped. Rapid industrialization need to be checked, and there should be some.
And what
screening.
goes in its place? The
Sorry?
garment trade stops. So what then goes in its place?
I mean, obviously, I'm not arguing for stopping the economic growth or the ending the economic growth or the ending the industries. I'm arguing that the industries should be made, or should incorporate the sustainable practices within its system.
Okay, so the industries need to be made more sustainable, which is basically a global thought. Every national corporation is making that argument. But for Bangladesh, from the global north or from the government to stop or to alleviate the 70% of land reduction, 30% food destruction, drop in GDP, what do you want to see?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm leading to basically, because industries, if we just halt the pace of the economic growth by making by making some conditions for the industries cannot run in the same pace of growth. Yeah. Exactly. That's where the lies the responsibility of the developed countries or the global north. Basically, they need to provide or they need to transfer. Funds. The technology and the knowledge also and the finance also in terms of climate finance. It could be in terms of investment also. So that the countries like Bangladesh can come out of achieving sustainability and at the same time adapting and mitigating with the impacts of climate crisis.
And should, for example, the British aid budget, which is a big controversy over here, should its allocation to Bangladesh be upped and specified to go into this direction as opposed to its numerous other
exactly
places?
And the UK is obviously doing. As we see from the last couple of years, they are doing huge climate funds for Bangladesh, and as we have seen yesterday, Norway government has given a specially designed climate investment fund for Bangladesh. So as you see, this kind of interventions are necessary to cope with the climate crisis in a country, and at the same time to pace with the developmental needs of the country. Because you see, if we adopt a radical approach in terms of alternatives to development in Bangladesh will face the double burden, or I would say multiple victimization from the climate crisis and from the developmental needs. So that's where it lies, from the combined approach, like from a global to local approach and to local to global approach.
Thank you. So it appears then that people or institutions are listening to your argument. Mohammed Gholam Sawa, stay with us, because I'm sure you will have your critics and people will we can get back to it on that. And now we are going to move, because we heard about the threat and fear of instability because of upcoming elections. We're going to move on to that thorny issue of democracy and freedom, because next up we have Professor Naomi Hossain, the developmental studies at SOAS, the University of London, author and contributor to many books about development and crises in what we now call the Global South. The Aid Lab is one that is well worth reading. She is going to move us into this area. What is civic space? What is legitimacy? And how much does authoritarianism help or hinder growth? Naomi Hossain, give us your argument.
Thank you so much, Humphrey, and thank you all for having us on this panel. It's a really great panel. I'm really pleased to have the chance to talk to you all about these issues. And as Dr. Nazneen pointed out, at this very politically quite crucial turning point in Bangladesh. And before I get really into it, just to pick up on one theme that I think has been resonating a bit with the two previous speakers. Was a lot of discussion about the model of development that Bangladesh has, and that Bangladesh has been pursuing. I think that one of the really interesting features about Bangladesh, and this is why this book about Bangladesh that I wrote some years ago was called The Aid Lab. I think one of the interesting things about Bangladesh is that it has always been, since its birth just over 50 years ago, at the very front lines of development, of all kinds of development, really, and on the front lines of global capitalism. We heard Sarah talking about the ways in which Bangladesh is affected, adversely affected by the growth in other parts of the world, the growth in the global economy elsewhere, the benefits of which are mainly going to countries elsewhere. But also on the front lines, of course, of the climate crisis. And I think that this is why it's very interesting and important to think about the model of development that Bangladesh has had. There's many lessons in that for the rest of the world. And one of the greatest challenges, I think, right now that Bangladesh is facing is reconciling its development model with its rising authoritarianism, its political model, if you like, which has been troubled in recent decades, we can say, I think. I think there's a really interesting point that the Honourable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina made a few years ago, and I think it's a very important and valid point that we should reflect on. She was asked about her government's record on human rights. When the West talks about human rights, of course, they mean political freedoms. They mean the right to go to a ballot box and put the vote in and get your leader of choice. Within, of course, a narrow range of the people that come to the position of being able to be a political leader. They mean that, and they mean free speech, and they mean those sorts of things. They mean a press that's moderately free, although, of course, owned by billionaires and that sort of thing, but moderately free in terms of journalists being able to write what they want. So that's what they mean by human rights. But Sheikh Hasina, quite rightly, I think, said, what about health and housing? Are these also not human rights? And I think this is the very important feature of Bangladesh's development, has been an emphasis on trying to achieve basic economic rights, and that's something that's really, through its history, this has been a really crucial part of its politics as well as of its economic development. And I think there's 4 points really that need to be made in this context. I think we need to really keep in mind in Bangladesh, thinking about Bangladesh's current growth challenges and thinking also about Bangladesh's current political impasse, you might say. I don't really know what's going to happen in the next few months, and anyone who says they know is probably making stuff up. But I think there are 4 points really that we want to keep in mind, and I think these are them. One is that the current government's legitimacy depends very substantially on its development performance. The second one is that its development performance has always been about more than economic growth and big projects, and it's much more to do with the economics of everyday life. And we heard Sohela, Dr. Nazneen, talking about inflation and the fact that people are surviving, not thriving. I think these are very important points to reflect on and keep in mind. A third point is that there are lots of people in Bangladesh and indeed outside of Bangladesh who say that Bangladesh could grow faster and could have much better public investment if it didn't bother so much with democratic accountability. And there we'll come back to that point as well. But the really important point for me, and this is where I'm getting to with this, is that Bangladesh's development success has always depended on a high degree of responsiveness. The government may not always have been very democratic in the Western model of having free elections and free media and so on, but it's always been quite good at listening to what people needed and wanted. It has had systems for ensuring that citizens' voices were heard. Whether or not those meet standards of democratic accountability, certainly they mostly did not. But nevertheless, systems for listening, and it's going to find that harder to do. It's increasingly finding it hard to listen to its citizens, to respond to its citizens, the more authoritarian it becomes. I just want to expand a bit on a few of these points. And this point about government legitimacy depending substantially on development performance is really important in Bangladesh. It's nothing new. And some people would even say, and we'll hear from the next speaker about some of these issues, I think, but some people would even say that this connection between the government legitimacy and development performance dates to the founding of the country, may even have helped prompt the founding of the country. Bangladesh wasn't just founded to represent the Bengali people, it was also founded because outside rulers had failed to protect people from disasters. The famous Bhola cyclone that struck in 1970, which was just weeks before the first elections that Sheikh Mujib, Bangabandhu, father of the nation, won so roundly. Those sorts of disasters, really shows that the foreign rulers essentially didn't care about the Bengali people, weren't there to protect the Bengali people. And so the birth of Bangladesh was not only about political representation, it was also about development. It's always been about socioeconomic progress in Bangladesh. And through the last 5 decades, governments that have not performed, who have not protected the citizens, have not enabled growth for the citizens, not just growth, but growth for the citizens, those governments have been either pushed out or they've been voted out. A government is judged very predominantly on how well it has performed in terms of development. And we call this performance legitimacy. The second point really is very much this point about development performance. And Sarwar also made this point that we really fetishize economic growth. And the ruling elites and the political and economic elites and the IMF elites and the World Bank elites, they all fetishize the GDP growth rate. But actually, that's not really the thing that legitimacy depends on. It's not that that doesn't trickle down. It does trickle down to some extent, perhaps more in Bangladesh than in some other places. But despite the growing inequality that Dr. Nazneen mentioned, but the fact is that, it's really very much the economics of everyday life that matter to people. Bangladesh is so exposed to the adverse effects of the climate crisis, as we know. It's the poster child, you could say, for the climate crisis. A legitimate government really has to protect its citizens against disasters. But Bangladesh is also very highly exposed to the global economic system. We've seen this twice this century alone, during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, and again during COVID-19. We saw what it's like to be so vulnerable to the global economy, what it's like to be dependent on essentially one good and one service: garments and migrant labor. This is what we depend on for our economic growth. And in recent years, it's been, as the Asia Foundation survey showed, high inflation, particularly of energy prices, has been the major source of discontent, popular discontent. The third point I was trying to make, I think, is that many people say, oh, well, if Bangladesh didn't bother with democracy at all, it could be like China or Vietnam, and we could grow really fast, and we'd have so many roads and bridges and factories, and it'd be great, shiny and new. And to some extent, that's already happening. We're not bothering that much with human rights or the environment when we're building power plants and big bridges and so on. So to some extent, that's already happening. But the trouble, I think, with thinking that we can adopt the Asian model of development is that the Awami League and the Bangladeshi say, they're not the Chinese Communist Party. They just do not have the capacity, even though they are more authoritarian than they were. They do not have the capacity to control their people. They cannot prevent corruption. They cannot ensure that programs and policies get delivered in the way that the leadership want. They cannot really discipline their people. They cannot effectively ensure that policies designed at the center are delivered around the country. So they can want to, they can aspire to be to doing the Asian model, the Asian tigers, as Sarah said. But in fact, it's just not. The Chinese Communist Party is a very particular kind of organization, and that is not what is ruling Bangladesh. And so this is really the brings us to the key point, the final point about civic space, authoritarianism, and democracy, and why these are so crucial for development success in Bangladesh, for the continued success of Bangladesh's development. And this is that it's Bangladesh's development success, and I have been studying this my entire life. It's almost 30 years now, I think. And I feel I speak, with a lot of foundations for this. Its development success has always depended on a degree of responsiveness. It's quite informal. It's not very visible to the outside world how this responsiveness happens. But where the Bangladesh state has succeeded in delivering social services, in protecting citizens against disasters, in food security, in a number of different social protection schemes and so on, that has delivered very well. It has done so because it's quite good at listening. It has been quite good at listening in the past. And I think this is becoming harder and harder as the government gets more authoritarian. One of the ways it's listened very well is by having a very vibrant media, and that has now been increasingly squashed and silenced. Another way in which it's been able to listen to citizens has been through having a very, very vibrant civil society, NGOs, civil society organizations, youth groups, local community organizations, human rights groups, all sorts. And these have been, Bangladesh is really very well known for this vibrancy of its civil society, its third sector. And nowadays, of course, it's much harder. You talk to any civil society activist, any human rights defender, they're all fearful, with good reason, because the government is locking people up with impunity, it seems, just doing what it feels like. It doesn't like any criticism, and people are very nervous. I'm told all the time not to put things on Twitter that are hardly even hostile, hardly even critical at all of the current government. People point to all sorts of individuals who have been jailed or faced charges and so on, just for saying really quite straightforward, for some very straightforward commentary on the government. So it's becoming harder for the Bangladesh government to listen to its people. It's in some ways cutting off its nose to spite its face. It's not wanting to hear criticism, and so it's going to find it harder and harder to deliver the things it needs to deliver to ensure its own legitimacy with the people. And this is the way in which democracy and development are connected in Bangladesh. I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much. There was a lot of food for thought there, and I'd like to ask you a totally impossible question. If you can't answer it, that's fine. Other people will. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this, thing that the West really hasn't answered itself yet about elections against health and housing, the vote against the health and housing. Is there any way that you could encapsulate for us the balance, because this debate is path to growth, so that balance between too much authoritarianism or not enough authoritarianism, corruption, ethnic rivalry. We talked earlier about gender equality, all these elements that are in Bangladesh and a developing society. Is there a good or a bad mix which helps or hinders growth?
I don't think any authoritarianism is a great thing for growth. I don't see how it's a boon at all. And we're looking, we're really staring down the climate crisis in Bangladesh. Nowhere is as vulnerable. And I think very much about what Sarah was saying about the climate finance and the needs in some ways for, if you like, for a lack of other language, reparations and so on. And I think that if I were the IMF or the World Bank or the British government or whatever, and looking at Bangladesh, thinking yes, we should send climate finance, I would look at authoritarianism, rising authoritarianism, and I would think, how transparent and accountable can a system like that possibly be? How much climate finance am I going to want to funnel to that country in that situation? I can't see anyone from the outside wanting to invest heavily. We see that there's so many levels at which this does not work. I think I think that in Bangladesh, though, we have had, we've had quite a tenuous relationship with democracy throughout. We've been in and out. But
is it going in the right direction from the Ershad days, for example, in the 80s and 90s? Is it I mean, one step forward, one step back, but is it moving generally in the right direction?
I think possibly not, actually. Okay. I think what we have had is we had 25 really quite golden years, 25 years in Bangladesh, where we had alternating, the main parties alternated in power, always led by women. I think it's very important to note this, because our heavy investment in social spending, I suspect, owes something at least to do with the fact that our political leadership has always been female since the democratic period. But we used to have a system called the caretaker government, which is very popular with whoever is in the opposition, and is currently not popular with the ruling party, and has been abandoned as a system for managing elections. Now, nowhere else in the world has these caretaker government systems. I don't believe that they are an institution that delivers democracy. They might deliver an election, but they don't deliver democracy. They don't deliver democratic institutions.
The temporary technocratic alternative. I mean, of the list that I just gave, which I plucked out of the authoritarianism, corruption, ethnic rivalry, and so on, which would you say is the most detrimental to growth?
To growth? Gosh. It's quite possibly corruption. I mean, ethnic rivalry is not a massive issue in Bangladesh. We are a comparatively homogenous society. I think corruption possibly is probably the reason why Bangladesh does poorly on business ratings. Okay. And that has to do with the fact that it's quite difficult to get big projects, big investments in energy and so on off the ground in a context in which very, very large bribes are required, in which there's very little transparency and accountability, in which everything is politicized. And alignment with the ruling party means you're more likely to get a contract, but not necessarily more likely to mean you're going to do the job properly.
Yeah, and of course, whether an autocracy or a democracy, corruption is always the devil, isn't it? That can.
Oh yes, absolutely. We watched with great interest the PP procurement in the UK, the corruption that went on there, without being addressed at all, so far as we can see. So it's not that democracies are corruption free. Certainly.
Before I let you step aside for our final panelist, can I put you a question from Ritesh S. Nigam, who says, what are the prospects for future foreign investment in Bangladesh, given what we were talked about? I thought it would be a suitable one for you.
It's a good question. I think it really does need to diversify production. But nonetheless, it seems that the ready-made garment industry is continuing to thrive. And in many ways to diversify, although it continues to have real problems with labor rights, with workers' rights. It never seemed to have taken on board the fact that workers have rights. It has, and this responds to SOAS points about sustainability, it has taken very seriously the green agenda. All of these beautiful new factories are being built in Bangladesh that are LED and in other ways green compliant. So they are continuing to develop that industry, and there is some diversification going on. I think that political instability is a very, very major deterrent to foreign investment, and will continue to be so over the next few months. We're expecting an election in January, and then that will be it for a few years. We don't
Just
know
give us the in a nutshell, who's fighting who in this election, and for what, at what stakes?
I really feel that I should leave this to the next speaker.
give us your view.
We have the ruling party, the Awami League Party, has been in power now since early 2009, after a landslide election that it won then. Since that election, the elections have been, I think it's safe to say, progressively less free and fair. There's limited expectation that the upcoming election will be free and fair. On the other hand, the government is making great assurances that the Electoral Commission is independent and autonomous and will do everything in its power to protect the rights to vote and so on. But the ruling party has just, I think, is currently at this very, not the ruling party, sorry, the opposition BNP party is at this very moment holding a vast rally somewhere, which you can see the pictures of on Twitter. So they are being allowed to meet, they're being allowed to rally. There is certainly some violence against them. There's violence on both sides, it should be said. But I think the consensus is that the opposition party is quite weak after many years in opposition, many years being jailed and harassed and so on by the government. And the Western powers, the Western countries, are putting some pressure on, particularly the US, putting some pressure on the government to ensure that the election is free and fair. But the fact of the matter is, you can't just start a democracy in a months before an election. That's not how it works. Yeah. Yeah. Not only that, democracy is not just about elections. There's a lot more going on. You need independent institutions. You need.
It's about health and housing, as we.
It is also about health and housing. There we are.
I'm now going to go, as you requested, to thank you so much for that. Our final panelist is Syed Badrul Ahsan, editor-at-large of the Dhaka Tribune, and he's a legend of regional journalism and commentary, author of many books, including From Rebel to Founding Father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, which tells the story of his country's turbulent origins, as we've been referring to in this debate. We are now going to hear more about how democracy was actually forged in Bangladesh today. Syed, give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Hawksley, and my appreciation for the earlier speakers who were there. They have put everything in a nutshell, and they have projected Bangladesh's problems and prospects in a very good way. Now, about democracy, yes, I think first of all, I would say for every one of us, everyone in every country, democracy is a state of mind. And where Bangladesh is concerned, democracy is still a work in progress. Now, it's been 52 years since we became a free nation. One might as well ask the question, why is democracy or the growth of democracy still a question in Bangladesh after 52 years? Now, we have had a very bumpy ride in all these 52 years. We began in Bangladesh, as Dr. Naomi Hossain pointed out, we had the first election in 1970, and that was the first election in what used to be Pakistan at that time, December 1970. And that was supposed to bring about democracy, introduce democracy in Pakistan. It didn't happen. We had a war, and Bangladesh became independent. But then we started off on the right track in 1972 through adopting a constitution. The very next day, within a year, we had this constitution, which was considered at that time a really great achievement, because there are hardly any, there are not very many countries which have a constitution within a year of independence, so on and so forth. But then we went to, but then we had these problems, these problems, the early 1970s, the economic problems, and we had this famine also, as Naomi Hossain herself has pointed out in the book, The Aid Lab, very well. And this famine we had, and political instability, the right wing was there, the extreme leftists were there, and then again, the problems that the government faced at that time. That was also an Awami League, the very first Awami League government led by Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the founder of the country and father of the present prime minister. Then after that, at one point, we began to slide a little. In 1975, January 1975, the parliamentary system of government, which was in place from January 1972, was replaced by what was given out by the government at the time as a national front, and all political parties ceased to function, and we had this Bangladesh Krishak Shramik Awami League, one national party, which was effectively brought into existence. After that, I'll be very brief with it because it's a long history. I'll make it short. After that, tragedy struck in August 1975 when Sheikh Mujib and almost his entire family were assassinated. 3 months later, in November on the 3rd of November 1975, four political leaders who were instrumental in organizing Bangladesh's War of Liberation in 1971. Sheikh Mujib was in jail in Pakistan at the time. They organized the War of Liberation. But after the coup in August 1975, they were arrested and placed in incarceration. They were killed in jail in the putative security of Dhaka Central Jail in November 1975. And then we had 21 years, 21 years of military rule or quasi-military rule. For example, from August 1975 up to June 1996, there were two military assassinated in May 1981. The second military ruler was General Hossain Muhammad Irshad. He was there for slightly more than 9 years, from March 1982 up to December 1990. And in between, the tragedy for Bangladesh is that we were supposed to move onwards to democracy, but then we fell victim to military coups and quasi-military coups and abortive coups, and we lost a number of military officers during that period, those 21 years, and that those 21 years can correctly be referred to as an age of darkness. Then another problem that we have had with our democracy is the return to the political center of political forces which actively opposed the independence of Bangladesh in 1971, and in fact sided with Pakistan. But by the mid 1970s, after the August 15, 1975 coup, they were rehabilitated and came back to politics. Now, let's move on. Then after Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League, they came to power. They returned to power for the first time in 21 years in June 1996. And Sheikh Hasina's party, the Awami League, was in power for 5 years till 2001, October 2001, at which point the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by Begum Khalida Zia, the widow of General Ziaur Rahman, came back to power. And they stayed in power for the next 5 years. And then we had a series of, in between, we had a number of what we call caretaker administrations or caretaker governments. But since the election of Sheikh Hasina's government came back to power in the December 2008 elections, it took office in January 2009, and it has been in power since. Of course, during this period, there was the election of 2014, in which the opposition BNP refused to participate. Then there was the election of 2018, and the opposition has always even today accuses the Awami League of having stolen the election, of having conducted something called midnight voting. But in these, this is the story of Bangladesh's democracy, briefly speaking. But see, we've had this journey, a democratic journey for Bangladesh, has been a very tortuous path to our position as citizens of a free country. As I said earlier, democracy is still a work in progress in Bangladesh, and I think I believe the issues which were raised by previous speakers about growth, about the economy, they were particularly relevant. But now, what matters is the future. We have had a wonderful, excellent economic growth, although from 8% to we've gone down to 6%. That has more to do with certain factors such as the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, and the global recession. But still, we are on the right track. Then again, we have we also have this other problem of handling a country. Any political leadership in a country like Bangladesh, which had a population of 75 million in 1971 when it became independent, today has anywhere between 170 and 180 million people in a space of 56,126 square miles. Then you add to that the problems of climate, which other speakers have already referred to, and I'm not going to go into the details. And well, we have other areas which again have been referred to, remittances, for example. Now, what do? Democracy, democracy, of course, depends fundamentally on the right of people to vote, freedom of speech, rule of law. That is there. But at the same time, it also depends on what facilities, what privileges you give to your people, to the country. And we in Bangladesh have been, I think, progress has been made economically. Remittances from our workers in the Middle East, they've been coming in, and we have our garments export. But yes, we do realize that for the country to go ahead, for democracy to progress, it's not enough to have people sending in their remittances from the Middle East or from just our garments going out abroad. We need to diversify our exports. We need to explore other areas. That is the emphasis that the government has been placing as far as policies are concerned. But all of this, again, speaking of the future, uh, it all depends on where we go from here. We will have elections in January next year. Now, what kind of elections will we have? How credible will those elections be? Now, today, as Dr. Hossain just pointed out, at this point in time, the opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party is holding a rally, is holding large rallies in Dhaka city, and they call it a blockade of the capital. And their point is that this government must be overthrown. That's the word they use. This government must be overthrown or ousted, and power should be handed over to a caretaker administration, after which the opposition will take part in elections. The government has repeated its position over the last couple of years or so that elections will be held under the government in accordance with the rules of parliamentary engagement, as in the West. And it says the government's position is based on the fact that it scrapped the caretaker administration system from the constitution. So there we have this divergence. Now, what happens? The opposition, the BNP, did not participate in. BNP is a very large party, and it has a huge amount of public support in the country, no doubt about it. But it boycotted the elections in 2014. In 2018, it says the elections were questionable. So it goes on criticizing them. Its point is that it doesn't want an election like the one that took place in 2018. Now, what happens if the election takes place, say, without the BNP? How credible will that be? Now, political observers in Bangladesh believe that if a major political party decides to boycott the election, that does not affect the constitutional system, and the government will safely return to office. Now, but from this point, if you move from this point onward, the next point is that the government's performance in the economy in the last 14 years it has been in office has been very impressive. So impressive in the sense that we do not have any food crisis nowadays. We have self-sufficiency in food. Infrastructure development has taken place, and we do have a slight problem with foreign exchange reserves, which a few months ago were above 41%. Now they've gone below 30%. That's a worry. But there are other worries also. Democracy has given us still a work in progress. We're still moving towards a better form of democracy. But in the meantime, in these few months, in these few years, it has given us good reason to hope for the future. We do believe, we certainly believe that this democratic system will be sustained, that in future we will not have any intervention by extrajudicial or extra constitutional forces that might disturb our democratic system of government. Even so we need in the future whatever happens in the election, or whoever takes part, or whichever party does not. I for one believe that the BNP will indeed take part, because it cannot afford to stay out of political contention for a long time, because any political party which stays out of the electoral process in a democratic situation, however big, however serious that, however problematic that system might be, that will be a difficulty. But what this, I'll come to the end very soon. What we need to take care of after January 2024, the next government that comes in, be it the Awami League government, be it some other government, this widening gap. Economic progress has been there, but there's also a widening gap between rich and poor. That has to be bridged. Then, for democracy to be sustainable, we need decentralization throughout the country. Right now, everybody who needs a job, every employment opportunity, people think is available in Dhaka. So in Dhaka, we have now 22 million people. So that's a big problem. Then we have this job creation will be there. There must be a bridging of the gap between political parties. Now, the language of politicians that we have been seeing in Bangladesh, not just today, but for the last so many years, it's a vitriolic language that has to be done away with. Then we need to have a depoliticization of institutions. All institutions of the government, they must operate as state institutions, rather than being subservient to the political party in power. And one other point, in Bangladesh, we need to go back to certain fundamental values which were there in the War of Liberation. One of them was secular politics. We need to go back there. And there are other problems. For example, we have this Rohingya issue, 1.1 million plus Rohingya people who are there in Bangladesh. And then we have this problem of urbanization in Bangladesh. See, we're losing our villages. Urban progress is okay, urbanization is fine, industrialization is fine, but then gradually, one after the other, we are losing our villages, our crop fields to industrialization, to urban housing. That needs to be it needs to be stopped. As I said, yes, we finally we need civic space, climate change, everything is there, but democracy is a state of mind, and this state of mind is something which should be focused on, not just by people like me, not just by civic society, but also by our political classes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Syed, for that encapsulation there. I'm going to come back to the panel. I'd like to bring you one question. If you could just answer a sort of yes or no on it from Prashant Kumar. Have the current government's policies on infrastructure and development boosted its popularity? And how likely is this to be reflected in the upcoming elections? Has it boosted or has it not boosted?
Is a question for me?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. Yes, it has. I mean, the government's policies and role in infrastructure development has certainly boosted its popularity, which is why the government is very confident and its supporters are very confident. As common citizens, the general run of citizens, they also feel that when the elections take place, even if the major opposition takes part, it will have a tough time beating the ruling Awami League at the voting.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like now to go back around the panel. There are a couple of questions that have come in from our audience, which I'm going to clump together. And if we can start first with Sohela Nazneen on this, which obstacles might hamper future growth for Bangladesh? That's MD Ishmael. And Ghulam Haidar, is Bangladesh's economic growth sustainable in the long term if it does not diversify production? Give us your thoughts on those two, the obstacles and the diversification. Sohela Nazneen.
So I'll start with the diversification, because I think that is where our challenge lies. Basically, I mean, you heard from me, but also other panelists and Lord Bruce, and there's a lot of literature and discussion around what happens when our advantage in garments industry runs out, because we do have other global competitors coming up, along with the advantage that they have cheap labor reserves. So where do we go when we are no longer the least developed country list, and our terms of trade change? So we will need to diversify. As we think about diversification and high-end industries, the challenge is basically, do we have the kind of skilled labor that we need and the kind of training that's required for that? But there's also requirement for capital, and then you also have to think about the global structure around trade, and also the structure that we have around intellectual property rights and other aspects that are global.
Where should it diversify to?
There are a few industries that we can think of, but then there is a question mark around that, all of that, because of the factors that I talked about. So, for example, pharmaceuticals we do have an advantage in that, but then how do we push it beyond the kind of not just the environment, the business environment that's there, but also around the legal aspects of global governance around pharmaceutical, how pharmaceuticals are governed.
Sorry to interrupt. Would I be right in saying that the biggest obstacle possibly to hampering the future growth of Bangladesh is this lack of debate and lack of initiative on diversification?
We do need to have a conversation around.
You need to have it. And is that the biggest single hampering of further growth, would you think?
Not necessarily. I mean, planning is one thing, and putting stuff in motion is one thing. But you also need to have a system of economic governance that people trust. You saw that in the rankings. We ranked the lowest in South Asia in terms of business environment. That is a challenge, particularly if you're trying to attract foreign capital and you don't have enough domestic capital, or domestic capital is flying out of the country, right?
Lovely point. So it's a lack of trust, basically, from the thing. The same question to Mohammed Gholam Sawa: which obstacles are hampering the future growth, and should it diversify?
Yeah, obviously, diversification, obviously needs to be there in terms of, as Dr. Nazneen mentioned, pharmaceuticals. We see there is a leather industry also, tannery industry also, which has some prospects in the context of Bangladesh. And we have some, our own homegrown industries like handloom industries in Bangladesh, which are also about to extinct. So, if the government come forward and make some investment in those potential areas, obviously the future is there. But I think there is another very important area probably the future government should be looking into, is the brain drain, or the young people alarmingly leaving the countries, especially if we see in the last 2 to 3 years to foreign countries, and they're not going back. The point which I've highlighted in my remarks also, the most important prospect or the potential which Bangladesh should utilize is the demographic dividend, or the youth in Bangladesh. Around 40% population belong to the age group between 20 to 35. So the next 20 years for Bangladesh is crucial, because if we cannot utilize the next 20 years and invest on youth-centric approaches, youth-centric incentives, probably this age group will be a burden after 20 years. You see, this age group will be 50, over 50. So the next 20 years is important. As I'll be echoing with Mr. Ahsan that obviously Bangladesh has made landmark growth. Now it has come to improve the governance, to improve the records of human rights and democratic values, and most
All right.
importantly, the institutions or the
Okay.
institutional accountability.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. We don't want to go too far off the precise questions. And I'm going to go around the panel before we move to Barry Gardner again, asking you to give me one word or one issue that is hampering, or the one that could help Bangladesh's future growth the most. I'll list out as many as I can before I ask the question. But Naomi, Hossain, which obstacles might hamper further growth for Bangladesh and the diversification issue?
Yes, I think this issue of trust and transparency is an important one for economic development in general, for the ability of business people to invest and really to stay in the country, and to keep their money in the country. It's a capital flight is a huge problem for Bangladesh, and that's partly to do with the fact that many business people don't know what their future is like in the country. So I would say trust in the state, the sense of stability of economic growth and political stability too, would be really important ones.
Is there an industry outside of garments or something that should focus diversification?
There are many. I mean, we've mentioned some of them. So light electronics is one. Then pharmaceuticals, Sohela mentioned already. Ceramics is another big one. Leather. In terms of services, I think the digital, the tech industry is growing certainly. Bangladesh has many like farms now. I don't know if you know this. If you want to buy followers, it's a good place to go. Okay. And so that's a whole sector of great growth, and probably some of that growth is not very well known about in the rest of the world. It's not very transparent. We can't find out about it.
A lot of potential there if the focus went onto it. Syed Badrul Ahsan, which obstacles hamper the further growth of Bangladesh?
I think it's the inability of politicians to reach out to each other in a spirit of cooperation. That is there. And then again, the question of human rights, freedom of speech. These are obstacles that need to be tided over by the government, by this government, any other government, in order for democracy to move ahead.
And which industry outside of garments should the government focus on diversifying to?
I think we have the small and cottage industry is there. That should be the focus. The tea industry should be focused on. And once we had jute, that has receded. That should also be brought into focus for future development, for additions to the national economy. And of course, there's these other the computer industry. These digital issues are also being dealt with by many industry in Bangladesh. That could be a way to the future.
Yes, sorry, I meant to say about agro-processing is also, like food processing and so on, have really developed in the last decade or so. Agro-processing has been a huge, big issue. Bangladesh is exporting all sorts of processed foods now around the world, and it's a really impressive sector.
Okay, so there is a lot of potential if anything can be done like with the garment industry. There's a lot of ground to move into. Now I want to go back around the panel, starting with Syed. I've noted down that the words that have come out: brain drain, trust, democracy, climate, corruption, authoritarianism, transparency, freedom, diversification. Give me one of those, or one that you want to do that could help most advance or is the most detrimental to Bangladesh's growth. Syed Badrul Ahsan?
Well, if you'll permit me, I will use the word tribalism here. We in Bangladesh have been in a state of political tribalism, in the sense that every political party exists in its own way. But the difficulty with the tribe is a tribe doesn't see beyond itself. So our political parties have been operating in that perspective.
Political tribalism is the biggest detriment.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. Naomi, Hossain.
So can I give a positive one?
Yes, of course.
So for me, and it's not one you said, resourcefulness. If you've ever been and traveled around Bangladesh, you will know the Bangladeshi people are the most incredibly resourceful people, particularly the women. You know, when you've got very little and that is often being threatened to be taken away from you, you do develop resourcefulness. It's very tough. I'm not saying anybody, you know, has an easy life there, but people are incredibly creative and incredibly resilient. And I think that's the thing that means Bangladesh will thrive.
That's a great asset. Political tribalism, a bad thing, and resourcefulness, a good thing. Mohammed Gholam Sawa, your one word.
I mean, for the looking forward or the detriment perspective.
Which one you think is most important?
Yeah, I think as I have said, I will be reiterating on creating an ecosystem where youth can harness their potentials and work as a catalyst for social change and development of the country.
Creating the new ecosystem that you so eloquently told us about. Sohela, Nazneen?
I'll go positive. Resilience. We are a very resilient nation. Very. You throw us any challenge, we will come out of it. We have always done so.
Absolutely.
We will do it again.
Resilience, resourcefulness, political tribalism, and a new ecosystem. Now, please, thank you so much for that, because we are handing over to the chair of the Democracy Forum, Barry Gardner, who has been tuning in from his office at the heart of Britain's parliamentary democracy. Barry, what are your thoughts about our debate?
My first thought is that I want to know where Naomi bought her cushions from. That jaguar and that caiman or that leopard and those crocodiles, just wonderful. No, look, it's been fascinating, and thank you very much to all the panelists. I don't need these on. I can hear myself. There we are. Can you still hear me? Yeah, good. Lord Bruce, as ever, set the scene, talking about the removal from the rural to the urban of the population, the over-reliance on the garment trade, the failure to diversify, and the problems of graft, red tape, and the brain drain. He talked about authoritarian politics, state capture and decay, and talked about how the banks were often shell operations undermining the financial system. And so often in what others came out with, they just picked up one of those threads and pulled it right out of the garment. Sohela Nazneen spoke about the low level of human capital in 1973, the remittances that had really kept the country afloat in a sense, but of course we heard later on how they were drying up, and that is also a problem. And she said, well, look, what will Bangladesh's growth look like? And brought out that word that we kept on coming back to: is it sustainable? Are we creating enough jobs, she asked. And if we're creating the jobs, do we have the political skills? Have we got the training and the education that's going to enable people to perform in those jobs, in those roles? She pointed out about the rise in inequality, the rise in poverty, and critically, I think she spoke about child marriage. Again, themes that were picked up later on in the conversation. She started us talking about climate, wiping out a third of agricultural production, and spoke of women as the burden bearers, the importance of gender equality, and really teased out where that did exist in basic education, basic healthcare, but then talked about the complete lack of agency over sexuality and violence and harassment. But she also talked about regulation and the rule of law, and in particular economic regulation. So she used the word thriving as the word that she wanted to encapsulate what she was talking about. And you can see that from what she said that you have parts of the polity which are thriving, and equally parts which seem to be decaying. Now, Mohammed Sarwar gave us a very comprehensive overview of the problems of capitalism in relation to the environment. He spoke again of sustainability against climate flooding. You know, scratch history and you find geography. This is a flat country. And that is, of course, the reason that 17% of the land, let's think of that, 17% of the land by 2050 is what we're talking about here. It's not just, oh, well, at some stage in the future. Believe it or not, that's just about as long as I've been a member of Parliament, by 2050. I've been in Parliament since 97, so 26 years. We're now 27 years and not quite off 2050. So it's, to me, that seems like an incredibly short space of time. And it's 30% of the agricultural production of the country. Now, that is huge. This is not just, oh, how do we diversify our economy? This is, how do we cope with a major catastrophe that is coming towards us? And that needs an emergency response. It needs a response that is on a war footing, not one that is simply, we need to grow the economy, we need to maintain business as usual, or even what Mohammed Sarwar was talking about in terms of the opposition between the extractive, I think what he called the extractive capitalistic economic system and of fossilized fueled capitalism and environmental sustainability. Now, he spoke about these things. He spoke about the Sustainable Development Goals, but he was when you questioned him, Humphrey, he backtracked, and I was very interested in that, because at the beginning he was saying the SDGs, you know, they're part of the problem, they're not part of the solution. You know, this is just tinkering around the edges and capitalism trying to keep going. You know, he said they're making the relentless exploitation of planetary resources and human capital. And he talked about the high emitters' duty to urgently cut their own emissions and also to compensate Bangladesh and other countries that have been affected by climate change so deleteriously. In effect, he rehearsed the argument that we know from the Club of Rome and the limits of growth 50 years ago. The hidden costs of liquidating natural capital assets as a constraint on long-term value creation. If you look at the report that's been produced by Partha Dasgupta, Professor Dasgupta, the Dasgupta review absolutely deals with this as its central issue, the commodification of nature. We've had the Teeb report, we've had the Dasgupta review. We go back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment when all these things have moved forward. But he backtracked when you put him under fire and said, well, is this actually going to happen? Is the world just going to say, fine, we'll stop growing? Because he talked about degrowth model, anthropocentric capitalism, deconstructing the North, the global North economic model. Where I think he made a really well-focused point was on the failure of the whole model of GDP. Gross domestic product is not a measure of growth. It's a measure of economic activity. And, you know, talking of Bangladesh, floods precipitate a growth in GDP because they precipitate huge economic activity. There's all sorts of economic activity that comes in the aftermath of a disaster, but it's not creating value. It's simply economic activity. So when under fire, he said, I'm not arguing to stop economic growth, but to incorporate sustainability. Look, I want to go back to these because these 17 sustainable development goals, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, all the things that we've been talking about that have come up in various ways in the conversation this afternoon. Affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsive consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land. And then we come to the big one. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. Strong institutions. And it seems to me that one of the things that we really then moved on to in what Naomi Hossain was saying was, look, let's look at this tension between the civic space and authoritarianism. And let's see if we can try and reconcile the economic, which there has been economic growth, there has been that boost, but with the civic development that needed and should have gone with it. And yes, she quoted Sheikh Hasina saying, you know, it's not just free elections and freedom of speech and freedom of the press. What about health and housing? Are they not also human rights? And of course, they absolutely are. But they're not an either or. And that's the tension that we're talking about here. And I thought her 4 points were very good. The legitimacy depends on development performance. Performance not really being on that macro, but on the domestic level. I don't mean domestic as a country, but the domestic for each family. And she also came back to that and talked about that fetishization of GDP and the problems that creates. You know, that domestication of the agenda, performance at a household level, just goes to prove the saying that all politics is local. Her third point, you know, perhaps Bangladesh could grow faster if it were more authoritarian, like Vietnam, like China. But actually, she answered that question by saying the Awami League just can't do it. They actually cannot have that centralized control to deliver it. And she sounded a number of notes of caution, the vibrant media now being silenced, the vibrant civil society being silenced, and really, I think, came to the conclusion that the country is possibly not moving in the right direction. She told us earlier that friends had said to her, don't put things on Twitter. So all I could say is thanks for agreeing to be part of a webinar going out to the world with Democracy Forum, because you certainly put a lot out on Twitter. You also spoke about the way in which the failure of civic institutions stopped investment. And there is no diversification of production without investment. And if investors don't have the confidence that their monies are going to be safe, that they're not going to have to pay exorbitant bribes, that there is going to be delivery, and that there's the competence to deliver, they're not going to invest. So Sustainable Development Goal 16 is absolutely essential, in my view, that peace, justice, and strong institutions. If you don't have recourse in law for your contract, you're not going to conclude that contract. If you don't have the confidence that there will be proper enforcement against graft, then you're not going to actually invest in that country, because increasingly in the global north, your shareholders and your consumers are going to be demanding that you are pushing all the way down the supply chain all those sustainable goals. Syed Badrul Ahsan spoke of democracy as a state of mind and a work in progress. He took us through a really helpful chronology of from the Constitution in 1972, the famines, the political extremes, the parliamentary system in 75, and of course then the assassinations, the military, and so on. So he brought us right up to date with the political progress. And again, he came back to the point, remittances are not a stable basis for an economy. The need to diversify exports. And he raised the prospect that the election might be boycotted by the BNP. But he said, well, look, that doesn't destroy democracy. And of course, I mean, we have the phrase, you've got to be in it to win it. I mean, if you simply say, okay, I'll leave the election to others, then, you know, you cannot come out of that with credibility. He focused, interestingly, on tribalism, the inability of politicians to reach out to each other as being one of the key blockers of the country's future. And of course, there, I come back to these, and I don't know if you can see it, but number 17 is actually partnerships for these goals. So 17, in a sense, the final one of the Sustainable Development Goals is about how we partner as not just the international community, but as local communities within a country to achieve all of the other goals. So I thought it was very interesting that he picked up on that partnership idea, the importance of cross-party consensus, of working together, but not just politicians, but all parts of society actually having that shared objective. And of course, that would push me back to my thoughts about the way in which really a war footing is required, a national consensus to deal with the issue of climate change. It's a consensus that I think is fracturing in other parts of the world, and that is a cause for huge concern. But it is something that I think is much needed if Bangladesh is going to be able to have the sustainable future that we were talking about. One final point, and that is the point that Naomi made about they have not addressed labor rights in the garment industry, but they have addressed the green agenda. I thought it was very interesting. One of the committees I sit on in Parliament is the Environmental Audit Select Committee. In fact, I'm supposed to be there now. But we did a report into the garment industry in this country. And we produced a very damning report for some of the factories, many of which actually have workers from the subcontinent working in them in Leicester. It received national attention. It prompted the directors of that company to go and try and rebut the claims that we'd made in it. Eventually they had to give way, and they've amended their practices somewhat. But what is driving back down the agenda, the whole supply chain, is this agenda of being green, being sustainable. And what we also need to ensure is being driven down the supply chain is labor rights, International Labour Organization, that being addressed as well. And here it's, you know, I look to the trade deals that the UK is now concluding with different countries, and it's noticeable that labor rights, human rights, don't figure in those. So we're relying on the commercial imperative that businesses have to please customers who are concerned about those things to actually drive change in many of the producer countries that are feeding into the supply chain. So, Humphrey, I will leave it there. I should get back to the Environmental Audit Select Committee, which I'm supposed to be in at the moment. But,
I'm getting messages through as to where you are, Barry. I mean, they're chasing you through me. But just before you go, very quickly, is the global north, as we've heard today, rowing back on climate?
Look, there are causes for optimism. I think the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, is a real cause for optimism. It's a major attempt to drive investment and business in the right direction in the United States, and it is working. The EU is coming up with a similar package. My own party, I would say somewhat half-heartedly, has come up with a similar package, if I'm entirely honest. But now I'm in danger of putting something out on Twitter that'll get me into trouble as well. The thing is, a lot of things are happening. There are lots of targets being set, but the truth is that it's not about setting targets. It's about delivery. And we're not actually implementing the policies fast enough to deliver on the targets that we've set. So that's why I reiterate that we need not just Bangladesh, but the world needs to be on a war footing against what is the greatest challenge we face.
So the revolution to the ecosystem that we heard so eloquently about here has got some challenges ahead. We'll let you go, Barry. Thank you very much indeed for summing up for us. And thank you, everybody, for taking part in this great debate, actually. Sohela Nazneen, Mohammed Gholam Sawa, Naomi Hossain, Syed Badrul Ahsan, Lord Charles Bruce for giving us a platform on which to debate, and our audience too for your questions and comments. Our next Democracy Forum debate is at 2 p.m. London time on October the 31st, the rise of extremism and radicalization in Central Asia. And after that, November the 14th, Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, the Subcontinental Brotherhood. Read our sister magazine, Asian Affairs. I have a copy here that drills down more on the issues that we debate, and it covers stories that you won't see in the mainstream media. Until later this month, from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and all at Democracy Forum, thank you and goodbye.
Allah.